next steps to resolve this most acute crisis. We'd like to stress yet again that the violence visited upon Israeli civilians since the start of October has no justification. We categorically repudiate and condemn them, all terrorist acts. We extend our condolences to all those who lost loved ones in Israel, Palestine, and in other countries. We demand the release of all persons held captive. Unfortunately, this tragedy didn't appear out of thin air. The protracted Israeli-Palestinian conflict was and remains at the epicenter of all Middle Eastern upheavals. For over 70 years, the Palestinian issue has remained unresolved, and it has prompted regional and international divergences of opinion. It's been exploited as an ideological motive by terrorist and extremist organizations in different parts of the world. What's more is, the fact that the issue is unresolved has resulted in untold suffering on the part of the Palestinian people, the Israeli people, Arab states, and all of the many Palestinian diasporas living therein, including refugees who've been forced to remain in camps for decades and decades. This state of play has been exacerbated over the last few years because Washington has acted alone, separately from our collective efforts, from agreed efforts. It's acted alone, imposing on Israel's Arab neighbors an economic peace without settling the Palestinian issue. We've reached a situation whereby there are now individual unilateral initiatives which not only ignore but actually undermine the international legal basis for the settlement of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, endorsed by the UN and enshrined in UN Security Council and General Assembly resolutions. The US has attempted to turn a blind eye to the ongoing construction of Israeli settlements on the occupied territory. It's recognized Israeli sovereignty over the occupied Golan Heights. And what we've now seen is the Americans calling for an end to the settler violence being foisted upon Palestinians in the West Bank. As a result, Palestinians who see no way out, and we see a conflict that's unprecedented in terms of its scope and risks spilling over to the entire Middle East. Over all these years, we've been warning about the fact that this course has no prospects. It's dangerous and can result in tragic consequences. This new outbreak of violence proves what we've said many times before. A normalization of Israel's relations with Arab states, although of course that would be positive, cannot occur at the expense of the Palestinians. It cannot result in a lasting stabilization of the situation unless we resolve a key issue in the Middle East, that is the Israeli-Palestinian issue. This approach, as we saw for ourselves when on the 27th of October, here in this chamber, we adopted the Jordanian resolution. This approach is supported by the leadership of all Arab, Muslim, and many other states. It's a paradox that on the one part, the entire international community has recognized that Israel's activities in these occupied Palestinian territory are illegal because they're at odds with UN Security Council resolutions and the provisions of international law. That's on the one hand, and on the other hand, our Western colleagues in their statements prefer to simply forget that this unprecedented escalation on the ground is also a consequence of the settlement policy of West Jerusalem, as well as the systematic restrictions West Jerusalem has placed on the Palestinians' ability to freely visit their holy sites. We're delighted that Antonio Guterres did not shy away from flagging this, speaking during Security Council deliberations on the Middle East on the 24th of October. He noted that the current uptick in violence did not happen in a vacuum. As a result, he was immediately subjected to irate and undeserved criticism on the part of Israel, which preferred to see history starting from a black page, to see history begin on the 7th of October 2023. Colleagues, we'll all have to return to the root causes of the conflict. We'll have to put the Israeli-Palestinian settlement process on an agreed track. However, right now we need to immediately cease fire and put an end to the bloodshed. This should be obvious to all, you'd think. Unfortunately, our Western colleagues at the Security Council are continuing to torpedo any efforts to de-escalate the situation on the ground. They continue to block the Security Council's attempt to urgently take measures to immediately normalize the situation, first and foremost to enact a ceasefire. This is what common sense dictates. What's more is, it's what humanitarian organizations in Gaza are calling for. Clearly, the fully fledged ground operation Israel has begun in Gaza can turn not just into a tragedy for 2 million Gazans, it can also trigger a regional conflagration. You'd think that everyone understands just how dangerous this scenario is, and yet it's only Washington which won't listen, which hypocritically is trying to pursue its own regional agenda, politicizing UN Security Council draft resolutions, trying to pass them, but we did not allow it to pass, nor did China. Our US colleagues are trying not just to divert attention from the failures of their policy to shift blame when it is itself at fault. They are accusing Iran, Hezbollah, and Gazans of all of the world's ills. They're also trying to legitimize all this, legitimize the ground operation through the Security Council. We remember the no-fly zone in Libya in 2019 when our Western colleagues had no trouble interpreting UN Security Council Resolution 1973 to their own benefit, waging an aggression on Libya. The UN Security Council does not have the right to grant this kind of carte blanche. President, I'd like to highlight that when we condemn the killing of Israeli civilians and foreigners in Israel, when we do that, we still cannot turn a blind eye to what Western Jerusalem is doing. They're committing flagrant violations of international humanitarian law in Gaza. Entire neighborhoods are being razed to the ground. According to information, we have over 8,500 people have been killed in the enclave. Most of them are women, children, and the elderly. Indiscriminate airstrikes have taken over 3,000 lives. Young Gazans are lying there under the rubble. Over 2,000 of them. Half of them are children. As a result of the latest strike on the Jabalia refugee camp in the Gaza Strip, over 400 people died. The number of losses amongst UN personnel is staggering. 64 people have been killed, 22 have been injured, and 42 UNRWA objects have been destroyed. The number of IDPs in the Gaza Strip stands at 1.6 million people. As a result of the bombing of the Strip, 9 hospitals are completely out of commission. The rest of the hospitals are facing acute shortages of medicines. Over 100 people, including over 300 people, including many of them children, have also perished in the West Bank. Against this backdrop, Israeli officials are making insulting pronouncements regarding all Palestinians, talking about the collective responsibility of an entire people, responsibility for the actions of Hamas. Israel's orders to evacuate over 1 million people are pronouncements that do not hold water. Also, the total blockade imposed by Israel on the Strip is unacceptable. It's cut off from the rest of the world. This blockade has provoked panic amongst these frightened people who've lost all hope. It's undermined the work of medical and emergency staff and will inevitably result in greater civilian casualties. You cannot vanquish terrorism using these means. We call on the parties to the conflict to immediately put an end to the bloodshed, to give mediators an opportunity to seek a diplomatic solution, including the swift release of hostages. We will have to go down this path sooner or later. The question is how many innocent people will die until the decision is taken to do so. President, colleagues, we cannot but mention the hypocrisy of the US and their allies. They, in other completely different situations, are issuing appeals for the respect of humanitarian law, establishing investigations, committees, imposing sanctions on those who are actually genuinely only resorting to force as a last resort to put an end to years of violence. And yet today we're witnessing horrific destruction in Gaza, greater than all the West criticizes in other regions. Greater by many orders of magnitude. We're seeing strikes on humanitarian objects, including hospitals, thousands of children dying, horrific suffering on the part of civilians under conditions of a total blockade, and yet the West remains silent. The only thing they can muster is continued pronouncements about Israel's supposed right to self-defense, although as an occupying power, it does not have that power as confirmed by the advisory opinion of the International Court of Justice handed down in the year 2004. We hope that these blatant double standards are obvious to our colleagues in the Global South. As for Israel's security, and we recognize its right to ensure its security, this security can only be fully guaranteed if we resolve the Palestinian issue on the basis of relevant UN Security Council resolutions. We do not deny Israel the right to fight terrorism, but fight the terrorists. Don't fight civilians. Otherwise, you yourselves are taking the side of evil. You are deploying the same methods evil deploys.